But what penance could ever cleanse the Christian blood that stains this soul?
Hey guys, it's Jay Steven. It is Tuesday, December the 5th, and of course tomorrow, Wednesday, December the 6th, is going to be the debut of the Nightfall series on History Channel about the Knights Templar. And so of course the following evening, that is Thursday, December the 7th, Real Crusades History will be doing a live stream analysis of that first episode right here on the Real Crusades History YouTube channel. So you can join us for that. I'll post a link to that in the bottom. But I wanted to talk today a little bit about an issue related to the Knights Templar that I thought would be kind of interesting, especially as we're getting ready to have the Nightfall live streams. So this is going to be a discussion of a wealthy French-born nobleman, Hugh, the Count of Champagne. He was born in 1074, or about then. And he was Count of Champagne from 1093 up until 1125. So he was a wealthy nobleman who ruled substantial lands in northeastern France. Of course, as we all know, the County of Champagne is one of the most important territories in what would become the Kingdom of France. Now, one of Hugh's vassals was another guy named Hugh, and this was Hugh, the Lord of Payan. Now, of course, if you know something about the Knights Templar, that name, Hugh of Payan, should be meaningful for you. So Hugh, the Count of Champagne, headed out for a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 1104. Now, of course, this was just within a few years after the great victory of the First Crusade. As we all know, the First Crusade had a tremendously powerful impact on Latin Christian civilization. People were very awestruck and enthused by the conquest of Jerusalem, and a lot of people from Latin Christendom wanted to head out to the Holy Land to visit the newly conquered territory, to make a pilgrimage to the holiest of cities, Jerusalem, where Christ had died. Now, so Hugh, the Count of Champagne, is one of those early pilgrims. And one of the men in his entourage, because of course being a great nobleman, he's going to travel with a large entourage of his vassals, his followers. One of the men in his entourage was Hugh of Payan. Now, when this pilgrimage is over, Hugh of Payan actually decides he's not going to go back with his lord. He's going to remain in the Holy Land to found the Knights Templar. This must have had a really big impact on the Count of Champagne, because about 10 years later, in 1114, Count Hugh is actually going to return to the Holy Land for another pilgrimage. This time, however, he's actually going to join his former vassal's new order, the Knights Templar. Interestingly enough, shortly after that, Bishop Ivo of Chartres actually wrote to Count Hugh, rebuking him for abandoning his wife to join what he calls the knighthood of Christ. So it's possible that Bishop Ivo made a bit of an impression on Count Hugh, because by the next year, 1115, Hugh was back in Europe. He'd returned to the County of Champagne to resume his role as the Count of Champagne. While he was there, he actually donated the land to the future Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He donated the land to the monk Bernard that was going to become the Abbey of Clairvaux. So this was, of course, the abbey that was going to be so central to the 12th century Renaissance, to the reforms in the church, and this sort of new Cistercian spirituality that became so important in Latin Christendom. So this issue of the Templars never seems to have left Count Hugh of Champagne's mind, because then, a little bit later in 1125, Count Hugh is once again going to depart his county, only this time he's going to renounce his title as the Count of Champagne for good. He actually gives his title to his nephew, Theobald. He departs, he gives up everything, all of his wealth, and he goes back to the Holy Land, this time to join the Knights Templar for good. And it's very interesting because note that he is now going to be a follower to one of his former vassals. His vassal, Hugh of Payne, who had been one of his men. This is a man in his entourage, in the Count's entourage. Well, Hugh of Payne is the first Grand Master of the Knights Templar. He's the leader of the Templars. And now Count Hugh is going to become one of his followers. So things kind of went full circle. This is very interesting. So Hugh of Champagne, the Count of Champagne at this time, was one of the great men of Latin Christendom. He was a very wealthy, very powerful man. And Count Hugh just gives all of that up. And we have to remember, too, at this time, the Knights Templar were not a wealthy or substantial organization by any stretch of the imagination. They were very small still. They did not have sort of the attention of Christian Europe yet. Hugh was one of the first noblemen to really pay much attention to them. They were often short of funds at this point, often short of horses. In fact, this is where the whole idea of the Knights Templar, their original seal just shows 2 knights on 1 horse. Well, this is where that idea came from, was the fact that they were very poor in their first decade or so of existence, and they often had to share. They didn't both ride. 2 knights didn't ride 1 horse at the same time, but they had to share horses. They didn't have a lot of horses. So you have to ask yourself, what would drive Hugh of Champagne to do this? And I think, obviously there's no easy answers. Of course, the piety of the man probably certainly comes into play. I think it is noteworthy that Hugh of Champagne, his home life, his domestic life, wasn't terribly tranquil as far as we know. Apparently, he had some questions about the legitimacy of his children. He doesn't seem to have been terribly close to his wife. You'll notice that he gives his county over to his nephew, Theobald, not to one of his own children, because he did have children. And he wasn't a young man when he decided to do this. And he did go back a couple of times, to the county of Champagne before he actually finally decided to become a Templar. But nevertheless, this is a really striking thing for a man to do. I mean, it's not like he was going into some sort of comfortable kind of retirement. He was joining an impoverished, sort of rugged, early Knights Templar who had this very, tough mission of going out into the dangerous pilgrim routes and trying to protect the pilgrims, oftentimes without sufficient force to do so. But nevertheless, they did what they could, and they were a great relief to a lot of pilgrims who were traveling. So I think that one thing this does point to is this incredible burgeoning spirituality of the Crusade that came about in Latin Christendom in the wake of the First Crusade. What was attractive to, it was very attractive to a lot of people, this idea of the monk knight. Not only is it just this idea of giving yourself to the monastic life, but it's this warrior monasticism. The Templars were not pacifist monks. These were monks who, yes, they took all the same vows as normal monks: poverty, chastity, obedience, but they also took this vow to defend Christendom. And this was a powerful thing for a lot of people from the Latin Christian world. This was a thing that really spoke to their spirituality. This idea of giving up everything to be a defender of the pilgrims, to be a defender of Christ's little ones on the way to Jerusalem. So, I just wanted to share that with you guys. I think it's a very interesting story. And, if you like this little short video, this short kind of mini podcast, I actually did a full podcast on the origins of the Knights Templar, which I did for my Patreon supporters. I'll post a link to that below. And if you become a Patreon supporter of $5 monthly or more to Real Crusades History on Patreon, then you have access to all of our exclusive podcasts on Patreon. But I just uploaded that, and I think it's interesting. It's something I feel very passionately about. I love the history of the Knights Templar. I think their origin story is quite interesting. So if you find this interesting, you can check out that podcast. But also, I do hope you'll join us Thursday evening. That is December the 7th. And I'll post a link to that as well below this video. I hope you'll join us for our discussion of the first episode of Nightfall, which is debuting tomorrow. So hopefully we'll see you here on Real Crusades History on the YouTube channel on Thursday. Thanks.
I am